The morning Edith Bancroft found the last letter Walter Sutton had ever sent her, she was standing in the ruins of everything she had believed her life would be, and she pressed that folded paper to her chest like it was the only warm thing left in the world. But we must go back to the beginning, because a love like theirs did not arrive without earning itself. It did not come easy, and it did not come without cost, and that is precisely what made it the kind of love that a person carries with them into old age like a lantern that never goes dark. The year was 1879, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas, sat on the edge of the great cattle trails like a man leaning over a cliff, half wild and half hopeful. It was a cattle town in the truest sense, loud and dusty and full of ambition that had not yet decided whether it would become greatness or ruin. The Kishom Trail ran straight through its heart, and every spring the longhorns came up from Texas in great churning rivers of horn and hide, filling the streets with noise and the air with the smell of sweat and leather, and the particular sharpness of men who had been riding for weeks without proper rest. Edith Bancroft had come to Caldwell 3 years before the story really begins, following her father, Harold Bancroft, who had established a modest dry goods store on the main street. Harold was a careful man, methodical and decent, with ink-stained fingers and a habit of writing everything down in small leather notebooks. He had brought Edith west from Cincinnati after her mother, Margaret, died of fever in the winter of 1875. There had been nothing left for them in Ohio, Harold had said, and Edith, who was only 19 at the time, had believed him because grief had a way of making a person willing to go anywhere that was not the place where they had lost something. Edith was 22 in 1879. She was a tall woman for the era, with dark brown hair that she kept pinned up sensibly, and eyes the color of river water on a cloudy day, which is to say a gray-green that shifted depending on the light and her mood. She was not the sort of woman who made men stop on the street to stare, but she was the sort of woman that men found themselves returning to, drawn by something they could not immediately name but would later describe as the particular quality of her attention. When Edith Bancroft listened to a person, she listened with her whole self, and in a world that was always moving, always shouting, that stillness was magnetic. She worked in her father's store, keeping the accounts and ordering supplies and wrapping purchases in brown paper with a neatness that customers appreciated. She read every book she could find. She wrote long letters home to a school friend in Cincinnati named Clara Hooper, who wrote back about balls and suitors and fashionable hats, and Edith read those letters with affection and a quiet sense that her own life, though less decorated, was somehow more real. She had not been looking for Walter Sutton. That was the first thing to understand. She was not one of those women who spent her days scanning the horizon for rescue. Edith was building something, slow and deliberate, and she had come to believe that whatever was coming, she would meet it on her own terms. Walter Sutton arrived in Caldwell in the second week of April, 1879, riding at the head of a trail crew that had come up from the sprawling Rocking T Ranch in South Texas. He was 27 years old, which he carried with the ease of a man who had worked hard enough that his body had stopped keeping strict count. He was broad through the shoulders in the way that comes from years of honest labor, not from vanity, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a face that the sun had weathered into something that told stories before his mouth did. His jaw was square and his eyes were the deep brown of good saddle leather, and when he smiled, which he did with some caution, as though he had learned that smiling too freely was a kind of spending you could not always afford, it reached all the way up to those dark eyes and changed the whole character of his face. He was the trail boss for the Rocking T, reporting to a rancher named George Tillman, who ran 4,000 head of cattle across the Texas-Kansas corridor every season. Walter had been making the drive for 6 years, and he knew the trail the way he knew his own breathing, but this particular year had been harder than most. They had lost 20 head to a river crossing that had gone wrong near the Cimarron, and one of his hands, A young man from San Antonio named Cord Elliott had broken his leg in the confusion of the crossing and had to be left to recover at a homestead along the way. Walter had arrived at Caldwell feeling the weight of those losses, and it showed in the set of his shoulders and the careful way he moved through the crowded streets, as though he was calculating everything in advance. He came into Bancroft's dry goods on his second day in town because he needed lamp oil and writing paper, which was a combination that Edith privately thought said something worth knowing about a person. Most of the trail hands came in for tobacco and new gloves, and occasionally something to send back to a mother or a sweetheart, but writing paper was different. Writing paper suggested intention. It suggested that a man had something inside him that he was trying to get out. He was at the counter before she looked up from her accounts ledger, and when she did look up, she registered first the trail-worn clothes and the hat he was holding in his hands with the careful courtesy of a man who had been raised to take his hat off indoors. And then she registered his face, which was honest in a way that a face could be without being simple. "Good morning," she said, in the direct and unhurried way she had of speaking. "What can I help you with?" He told her what he needed. She got the lamp oil from the shelf behind her and set it on the counter, and then she went to the glass case where they kept the writing supplies, the paper and the envelopes and the small bottles of ink, and she chose a good weight of paper and brought it to him. "You do a lot of writing?" she asked, and it was not flirtatious, only curious, and he seemed to understand that because he answered without the guardedness that men sometimes showed when they thought they were being managed by a woman. "I try to," he said. "I've got a younger sister in Texas, Agnes. She's 17. I write her when I can." He paused, and then he added, as though he was not quite sure why he was adding it, "She lost our mother 2 years ago. I try to keep her from feeling too far from things." Edith felt something shift in her chest, small and quiet, like a door opening just an inch. "That's a good thing to do," she said simply. He paid for his items, and he thanked her, and he left. That was all. It was not the kind of meeting that announced itself as significant. It was the kind that happened every day between people and only became significant in retrospect, when you looked back from some later vantage point and could see the shape of what had been set in motion. But then he came back the next day. He said he needed boot blacking, which was reasonable, and he bought it. But he also stayed at the counter for nearly 20 minutes talking to Edith about the trail drive and the difficulty of the Cimarron crossing and the young hand he had left behind, Cord Elliott, and whether she thought the boy would be all right. He said it with the kind of controlled worry that belonged to a man who was responsible for other men and did not permit himself the luxury of showing that worry too openly. "What did the family say when you left him?" Edith asked. "The Hendersons," he said. "Good people. They said they'd take care of him, see him to a doctor in the nearest town. I gave them what I could for the trouble." He turned his hat in his hands. "It still sits heavy." "It would," she said. "That's not a bad thing. That's what responsibility feels like when you're carrying it properly." He looked at her then, a long, considering look, as though he was seeing something that surprised him. "You're very direct," he said. "My father says that too," she replied, and she smiled, and he smiled back, and there it was. That was the door opening wider. He came back the day after that, and this time he did not bother with a pretense of needing something. He stood at the counter with his hat in his hands, and he said, "Miss Bancroft, would you be willing to walk with me this evening? There's supposed to be a good sunset." And Edith, who had been waiting without knowing she was waiting, said yes. The sunset was extraordinary, as Kansas sunsets often were in the spring, the sky running from deep gold at the horizon through shades of orange and pink, and finally to a vivid purple overhead, the whole prairie lit up as though it was trying to show off. They walked along the edge of town, where the buildings thinned out and the grass began, and Walter told her about Texas, and she told him about Cincinnati, and they found out that they had both lost their mothers, though his had died of a sudden fever and hers had gone more slowly, and that particular shared sorrow made a bridge between them that would have taken months of ordinary conversation to build. He stayed in Caldwell for 2 weeks before the business of the cattle drive required him to move on. In those 2 weeks, they walked together 5 times, and once Edith's father Harold joined them for supper at the hotel dining room and approved of Walter in the wordless way that Harold approved of things, by not disapproving. They talked about everything, it seemed, about books and cattle and the nature of the land and what the future might look like. And the more they talked, the more it became clear that something was happening between them that neither of them was quite equipped to name, because neither of them had any real practice with it. On the last evening before Walter was due to ride back to Texas, they stood together at the edge of town in the cooling air of a spring night, and he held her hand for the first time, just held it, standing there looking out at the dark prairie. "I'm going to write to you," he said. "I hope you do," she told him. "I mean it," he said with a gravity that she understood was not dramatic. It was simply his nature. When Walter Sutton said a thing, he meant it all the way down. "So do I," she said. He rode out the next morning before she was properly awake, and she stood at the window of the apartment above the store where she and her father lived and watched the small figure of him moving south through the early light until he was indistinguishable from the land. And she thought, this is either the beginning of something or the end of something, and she was not sure which. Then, 11 days later, the first letter arrived. She recognized his handwriting before she recognized his name on the envelope, because she had seen it on a list he had shown her once, an inventory of the cattle he was responsible for, and she had thought even then that there was something in the way he formed his letters, careful and slightly larger than necessary, like a man trying to be clear, that she found appealing. She sat down at the table in the store before even her father had come downstairs, and she opened the letter with deliberate care. It was 3 pages, written on the good weight paper he had bought from her, and it was the kind of letter that a person who is not accustomed to writing personal letters writes when they are compelled to by something stronger than habit. It was honest to the point of awkwardness in places. He wrote about the ride south, about how the land changed as you moved down through Indian Territory and into Texas, about the way the sky was different there, wider and flatter and more demanding. He wrote about Agnes, his sister, who had been well and was now helping with the cooking at the ranch. He wrote that he had thought about their conversations often on the ride down, and that he hoped she would not think it too forward if he said that Caldwell had felt different after meeting her, had felt more like somewhere worth arriving at. She read that sentence 3 times. She took out her own paper and wrote back immediately. She told him about a new shipment of books that had come in, and about a dispute between 2 local ranchers over a fence line that had occupied the whole town for a week, and about her father's ongoing project of cataloging every variety of grass seed available through the suppliers, which she found endearing and slightly absurd. She told him that Caldwell had felt different since he had left, though she did not specify how, and she thought that was honest enough without being reckless. She sent it, and he replied, and she replied to that, and so it went. By August of 1879 they were writing every 2 weeks, and by October they were writing every week, and the letters grew longer and more detailed and more personal in the way that letters do when 2 people are using them to build something together. Walter wrote about the ranch, about the particular difficulties of managing men who were sometimes very young and sometimes very proud and occasionally both at the same time. He wrote about a horse he was training, a gray gelding he had named Plato for reasons that he said were too long to explain in a letter, which made Edith laugh and write back demanding the explanation, which led to 3 pages about a book his school teacher in East Texas had given him when he was 12 years old, which led to the discovery that they had both read Marcus Aurelius, which led to a conversation about Stoicism and the nature of endurance that stretched across 4 separate letters, and was one of the most remarkable exchanges of Edith's life. He also wrote about loneliness carefully, in the way that proud men write about difficult feelings, with a kind of indirection that is somehow more affecting for what it does not quite say directly. He wrote about the size of Texas and the way that size could make a person feel very small, and about the pleasure he took in having something to look forward to, which she understood was the letters, which she understood was her, and she pressed her fingers to those pages and felt the warmth of him through the paper. She kept every letter. She had not decided to do so. It was not a formal resolution. She simply could not bring herself to throw any of them away, and so she put them in the tin box that had once held her mother's good buttons, a small rectangular box of painted tin with a pattern of blue flowers on the lid that she had carried from Cincinnati. Her mother's buttons she had put in a cloth bag, and the tin she had claimed for her letters, and she put them there in order, each one in its envelope, and she put the box in the trunk at the foot of her bed. She did not tell Walter she was keeping them. She did not tell anyone. It was a private thing, the way certain forms of tenderness are private because to expose them would be to change their nature, and she wanted them to remain exactly what they were. In November of 1879, Walter wrote to ask if he might come back to Caldwell in the spring, and the question was about a cattle drive, technically, because the Rocking T was planning another run north in April. But the way he asked made it clear that the cattle drive was not the primary reason for his interest in the return, and Edith wrote back saying that she would be glad to see him, which she knew and he knew was more than it appeared to say. Harold Bancroft watched his daughter's correspondence with the quiet observation of a man who understood more than he expressed. He said to Edith one evening in December, sitting by the wood stove with his notebook, "This cattle man, Sutton." "Yes, father," Edith said without looking up from her sewing. "He writes often." "Every week," she confirmed. Harold was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your mother wrote to me every week for a year before I worked up the courage to court her properly." Edith looked up then. Her father was looking at his notebook with great attention, as though the words there were particularly fascinating, and she understood that he was giving her something, a piece of her mother's story and a kind of blessing all at once, and she felt the fullness of it settle in her chest. "He's a good man," she said. "So I supposed," Harold said, and went back to his notebook. The winter was long, as winters in Kansas could be. The winds came down off the prairie, and the snow was sometimes impassable, and the town drew into itself like a hand closing, quieter and smaller and more turned inward. Edith and Walter's letters continued through it all, the postal service being one of the great achievements of the era, running even in difficult conditions, because the country had decided that communication was worth the cost of maintaining. She learned things about him in those winter letters that she could not have learned any other way. She learned that he had been afraid of water as a child, after nearly drowning in a creek, and that he had made himself learn to swim at 16 because he refused to be governed by fear. She learned that he had once considered becoming a preacher in his early 20s, because a circuit preacher who came through his county had seemed to be living a life of genuine purpose, but that he had realized eventually that what he loved was the land itself, the particular weight of it, the way it responded to attention and effort. She learned that he still sometimes felt his mother's absence as a physical thing, like a room in a house where the furniture has been removed, and the walls still show the marks of where it stood. She wrote back things she had not told anyone. She told him about the specific grief of watching her mother die slowly, and how she had sometimes wished it would be faster and then felt guilty for that wish, and how she had come to understand that the wish was mercy, not cruelty. She told him about the dream she still occasionally had where she was in her mother's kitchen in Cincinnati, and everything was ordinary, and she woke from those dreams both comforted and devastated. She told him that she had found, to her surprise, that she loved the prairie, the way it made visible a person's actual scale in the world, which she thought was useful information for a person to have about themselves. She sent those letters and then sometimes lay awake worrying that she had been too open, that she had given him more than he was ready for. But his replies always met her honesty with his own, matching her, and she came to understand that this was a rare thing and should be treated as such. By February of 1880, she was quite sure she was in love with him. She had not arrived at this conclusion quickly or carelessly. She had examined it from all sides, as she examined everything, and she had concluded that what she felt was not infatuation, which she understood to be a kind of weather, passing and unreliable. What she felt was more like a change in the landscape itself. Everything looked the same but was oriented differently, as though the whole world had quietly shifted to point towards something. She did not write this to him. She thought it would be better said in person, and he was coming in April. March was interminable. She kept herself busy, took on extra work ordering the summer stock for the store, helped a neighbor woman with a new baby, started reading a novel about the French countryside that Clara Hooper had sent from Cincinnati, but she could not outrun the anticipation. It was a physical thing, present in her chest every morning when she woke, and she went to it consciously when she needed to. She would open the tin box and take out the stack of letters and hold them, not reading them, just holding the weight of them, all those pages of his careful handwriting, and it was like holding evidence of something real in a world that sometimes made real things feel provisional. She had never counted them, but there were, by March of 1880, 37 letters from Walter Sutton in that tin box. He arrived on the 15th of April, 1880, at the head of a smaller crew than the previous year, riding in on a buckskin mare he had switched to after Plato had gone lame the previous autumn, and Edith saw him from the window of the store before he saw her, and her heart did something that she thought was undignified and was also entirely beyond her control. She was composed by the time he came into the store. She was always composed on the surface, because composure was something she had worked at. But when he came through the door and took off his hat and looked at her with those dark, serious eyes, composure got somewhat harder. "Miss Bancroft," he said. "Mr. Sutton," she said. They looked at each other for a moment, the room full of the months between them, and then he smiled, that careful, warming smile, and she felt the tension in her shoulders release. "You look well," he said. "So do you," she told him, which was true and was also an understatement, because he looked like everything she had been picturing for 6 months, which is to say he looked very much like himself, which was the most unsettling and wonderful thing he could possibly look like. He was in Caldwell for nearly 3 weeks this time, because the business of the cattle sale and the dealings with the buyers took longer than expected, and George Tillman, his employer, was negotiating new terms for the following season, and all of this required Walter's presence and attention. He did not mind. That was the clear impression Edith had, that he did not mind the delay. They walked every evening, and sometimes they rode out together on the horses that Harold kept for business use, out into the open country east of town where the land was flat and the sky enormous. They talked constantly. They also found in this new arrangement that they could be comfortable in silence, which is a test that means something. Silence between two people is either evidence of nothing to say or evidence of the kind of ease that does not require saying, and with Walter and Edith it was clearly the latter. He told her things in person that he had written to her in letters, but differently, and she found that she loved both versions. He told her about his plans, careful and measured, the way he discussed everything. George Tillman had been talking about expanding the ranch, buying land further north, possibly even in Kansas, and Walter had a position that would grow with that expansion if things went well. He did not say directly that he was building towards something that might include another person, but it was in everything he said, and she heard it the way she heard his letters, between the lines. On the third Thursday of his visit, they were sitting on the steps of the store in the evening, the town quieting around them, and he turned to look at her with an expression she had not seen before, a kind of concentrated seriousness that she instinctively braced for. "Edith," he said. He had moved to her first name a week into this visit, and she had moved to his, and both of those transitions had happened so naturally that neither of them had noted it at the time, but both of them had felt it. "I want to say something that might change things." "Then say it," she told him. "I'm not an easy man to know," he said. "I'm away more months than I'm home. I'm not demonstrative in the ways that a woman might reasonably expect. I have responsibilities that I intend to honor." He paused and she waited, because she understood that he was not saying any of this as warning. He was saying it as honesty, which was different. "But I have been thinking about you every day for a year, and I believe that what I feel for you is something I do not intend to let go of if you feel anything similar." The sun was going down behind the roofline of the buildings across the street, painting the dust in the road gold. A few horses moved at the hitching posts. A dog barked somewhere and was answered by another. "I feel something very similar," Edith said. He exhaled, and she realized he had been holding that breath, and she found that extraordinarily moving, that this man who was so composed and careful had been holding his breath. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had on that last evening a year ago, except that this time it was different because they had a year between them and 37 letters and the knowledge of each other's particular architecture. "Then I'd like to court you properly," he said, "with your father's knowledge and your agreement." "You already have both," she told him. She thought of her father's comment about her mother and the letters, and she smiled. "My father gave his approval months ago in his way." Walter looked slightly startled. "He did. He mentioned my mother's letters," Edith said. "That was Harold's way of telling me what he thought." Walter shook his head slowly, and the smile came, the full one, and he said, "I think I understand your father." He talked to Harold the following morning, and Harold, in his direct and economical way, said that he appreciated Walter's intentions and that he trusted Edith's judgment, and that he had one condition, which was that any arrangement they made would take into account Edith's happiness as a primary consideration, not a secondary one, which Walter looked Harold in the eye and agreed to without hesitation. He left Caldwell at the end of April, and the letters continued. But now they were different. They were still honest, still detailed, still full of the particular texture of two people's lives, but there was something more direct in them, a future being constructed between the lines, because they were both now building toward something rather than simply corresponding. He wrote about the land up in Kansas that Tillman was considering, and she wrote about whether she could leave her father and the store, and they wrote honestly about the difficulty of that question because Harold was aging and the store was the whole foundation of his life in Caldwell. In July of 1880, Harold Bancroft had a heart episode. He did not die. He was laid up for 3 weeks and then he recovered substantially, though not completely, and the incident altered the calculus of everything. Edith wrote to Walter immediately, and he wrote back with a warmth and an urgency that she had not quite seen from him before, asking what she needed, asking how her father was, asking how she was managing, and the caring in those questions was so direct and unguarded that she cried over the letter in a way she rarely permitted herself to cry. She managed. She was good at managing. She kept the store going through the hot summer with the help of a young man named Tommy Garrett, who Harold had occasionally employed, and she sent detailed reports to her father's suppliers and maintained all the accounts and saw that everything kept running. But at night she was tired in a way that went past the body, and she reached for the tin box sometimes and just held it, because it was the most concrete thing in her life right then, that stack of letters, that evidence of Walter. In September, Walter wrote that he had talked to Tillman and that he had a proposal to make, not only a personal one but a practical one, and that he wanted to make it in person and would come to Caldwell in October if she was agreeable. She wrote back a single sentence, "Come as soon as you can." He arrived on the 8th of October, 1880, and he came straight to the store from the livery without changing out of his travel clothes, which Edith noticed and was moved by. Harold was sitting in the back of the store in a chair that had been arranged to give him work he could do without standing, cataloging the new seed inventory with loving attention, and he looked up when Walter came in and said, "Sutton," with the warmth of a man who has decided something. Walter greeted Harold with the genuine respect that Edith had always observed in him toward his employer, and then he turned to her. "Can we walk?" he asked. They walked to the same edge of town where they had walked before, though now the light was October light, thinner and more golden than April, the prairie grasses gone bronze and tan, the sky a clean, hard blue. He told her Tillman's proposal first, because he was practical and he understood that the practical mattered and should not be treated as lesser than the personal. Tillman was buying 3,000 acres of land 20 miles south of Caldwell, and he wanted Walter to manage it as a full ranch operation, not just a trail crew. It would mean Walter was based in Kansas permanently. It would mean he was no longer on the trail for 6 months of the year. It would mean he was, for the first time since he was 19 years old, in one place. That's a significant change, she said. It is, he agreed. It's the kind of change that makes other changes possible. She looked at him. Edith, he said, and his voice had the quality of something long held being finally set down. I would like very much to marry you if you'll have me. I know your father needs you close. The ranch is 20 miles, which is not nothing but is not impossible. I know you love the store and your father's work. I'm not asking you to give anything up, only to add to what you have. If that can be made to work for you, it's all I want. She stood in the October afternoon and looked at this man she had been falling in love with for a year and a half through 37 letters and several thousand words of careful, honest exchange, and she felt the full weight of the moment. Yes, she said. That's a yes, Walter, to all of it. He took both her hands in his and he said, good, in the way that he said things that mattered to him, quietly, but with everything behind it. He kissed her for the first time right there in the prairie light, and it was not tentative, because neither of them was tentative by nature. And when they walked back to tell Harold, they were holding hands in the open, which was declaration enough in a town that watched everything. Harold Bancroft received the news with the glassiness of eyes that don't quite cry but come very close, and he took Walter's hand and held it for a moment and said, "Take care of her." And Walter said, "I intend to take care of her for the rest of my life." And Harold nodded and said, "Good man," and went back to his seed catalog with the particular serenity of a man who has finished a long task. They were married in November of 1880. In the small church on 2nd Street, which was a simple wooden building with not quite enough room for the number of people who came, because Caldwell had the kind of community that showed up when there was something worth showing up for. Edith wore her best dress, a blue-gray wool that matched her eyes depending on the light, and Walter wore a suit that he had clearly purchased specifically for the occasion and wore with the careful discomfort of a man who preferred working clothes. Agnes Sutton had come up from Texas, 17 and bright-eyed, and immediately devoted to Edith in the way that young women can be when they recognize that their brother has managed something genuinely good. She stood with Edith and held her flowers and cried, which set off Mrs. Henderson from 2 doors down, who always cried at weddings and needed very little encouragement. The ceremony was simple, and the words were plain, and Walter said his with that complete steadiness that was so characteristic of him that it made the steadiness itself feel like the declaration. Because when a man who is never careless speaks with care, you know he means every syllable. They had a small reception at the hotel dining room, and Harold toasted them with a glass of cider and a few carefully chosen words. And Tommy Garrett played fiddle badly but enthusiastically. And several of Walter's trail hands who had been in the area drank and told stories about him that he bore with the contained suffering of a man who knows that dignity has its limits at a wedding. They settled into the working rhythm of their new life, which required practical arrangements. Walter spent most of his days at the Tillman land south of town, which was in the early stages of being developed into a proper ranch. He rode out in the mornings and came home in the evenings, and the 20 miles was a real consideration, but they had horses and will, and a man who is determined to come home comes home. Edith continued to work in the store with her father, because the store was Harold's life, and her presence was both practical and comforting to him. And she and Walter had agreed that this was how it would be, And Walter not only accepted this but genuinely respected it, which Edith thought was one of the most attractive things about him, that his respect for her independence was not performed. He actually believed in it. They had a small house at the edge of town, 3 rooms that Walter had rented, and that Edith made into a place of considerable quiet comfort with very little money and considerable ingenuity. And on the evenings when Walter came home and they ate supper together and talked about the day, Edith thought she had never been so anchored in her life. She still had the tin box. She had put it in the trunk at the foot of their bed, under the quilt that had been her mother's, and she had continued to add letters to it, because Walter still wrote to her when he was away from home, which happened occasionally when he needed to ride to Wichita on Tillman's business, or when he went south to Texas once to handle a dispute about cattle ownership that required his presence. The letters from the married time were different from the courtship letters, more domestic in their way, full of the details of shared life and shared plans, but still with that quality of careful honesty that had always characterized his writing, and she loved them no less than the first ones. He did not know about the box. She had never mentioned it because it had never come up, because it was her private thing, the way that certain tenderness is private until the moment when it needs to be shared. In the spring of 1881, they learned that Edith was pregnant. She told Walter on a Tuesday evening when he came home from the ranch, tired and dusty from a long day of fence work, and he stood in the kitchen doorway, and she said it plainly, the way she said everything, and he set down his hat and crossed the room and took her face in both his hands and looked at her for a long moment with an expression that she had no category for. It was not quite joy and not quite terror and was entirely both, and then he said, "We're going to be all right," which was his particular way of saying that he was going to make absolutely certain of it. Harold Bancroft, told the following day, produced his nicest notebook and began making a list of things the baby would need, which Edith found so characteristic of him that she hugged him and held on for a moment longer than usual. The pregnancy was without serious complication, which was not something they took for granted in 1881. Edith was careful and sensible about it, continuing to work in the store through most of the summer because sitting idle made her anxious, and Walter rode home every evening without fail through the heat of the summer months. Agnes came up from Texas for the last 2 months, because she had written to say she wanted to help and Walter had written back saying please come, and having her in the house was a gift because Agnes was genuinely useful, cheerful without being tiring, and deeply attached to both of them. Their son was born in October of 1881, on a cool and clear evening that smelled of wood smoke and autumn grass. The doctor, a steady-handed man named Harlan Cole who had set up practice in Caldwell 2 years prior, was present for the birth, and Agnes was there, and Harold sat in the parlor and wore a groove in the floor with his pacing, which was the most animated anyone had ever seen him. They named him James Harold Sutton, the James for Walter's father and the Harold for Edith's, and James was from his first minutes an opinionated and loud personality that both of them found both exhausting and magnificent. Walter held his son for the first time sitting in the chair beside the bed, and Edith watched him from the pillows, depleted and warm and completely awake, and she saw on his face something she had glimpsed only in pieces before, a kind of openness, an unguarded fullness, and she thought that she loved him more in that moment than she had ever known it was possible to love anyone, and that was a very large thought given how much she had already known. James grew. He was a vocal baby and an energetic toddler who developed very early opinions about which foods he would and would not eat, and a particular passion for horses that appeared to be congenital, because he was reaching for Walter's horses' noses before he was steady on his feet, and Walter, who loved horses with the informed passion of a professional, found this both worrying for practical safety reasons and deeply satisfying as a character trait. The ranch grew too. Tillman bought additional land in 1882, and the operation expanded, and Walter's responsibilities expanded with it. He was no longer just trail boss but ranch manager, overseeing the hands and the cattle and the land itself, and he was good at it in the comprehensive way that a person is good at something that suits their entire nature. He was fair with the men who worked for him, firm when firmness was required, and they respected him in the way that men who work hard respect a man who works harder than they do without making a show of it. Edith's father's health continued in its careful decline, neither catastrophic nor improving, a slow diminishment that Harold bore with great equanimity and practical good cheer. He kept the store with increasing help from Tommy Garrett, who had grown into a reliable young man, and Edith managed the accounts and the ordering and visited every day. She had reduced her hours at the store since James was born but had not relinquished her role there, because the store was still important to Harold, and she would not take herself from him while he still wanted her there. In the winter of 1882, going on 1883, a difficulty arrived that was not about disease or weather or cattle prices. It was about a man named Preston Cal. Preston Cal had arrived in Caldwell in September of 1882 with money and ambition, and the kind of smile that people immediately recognize as separate from genuine goodwill. He had bought a piece of land adjacent to Tillman's holdings and had announced intentions to build a competing cattle operation, which was entirely within his rights. The trouble came from the manner in which he intended to compete, which was not fair dealing but something distinctly to the other side of it. He began poaching Tillman's hands with offers of higher wages that he could not actually sustain and did not intend to. He interfered with water rights that Tillman's operation relied on, manipulating a small creek's access points in ways that were technically legal but openly hostile. He spread stories in town about the quality of Tillman's stock that were false and demonstrably so, but the damage of a rumor does not wait for correction. Walter handled it. He handled it in the way he handled most difficult things, with patience and documentation and the willingness to be very direct when directness became necessary. He went to Cal once, in person, and explained in clear terms what was happening and that it would stop. Cal had smiled his disconnected smile and said he didn't know what Walter was referring to. Walter then documented everything, every incident, every conversation, every interference with the water, and brought the full record to the county sheriff and to a lawyer in Wichita with whom Tillman had a standing relationship. The legal process moved slowly, as legal processes do, but it moved, and Cal's various manipulations were one by one addressed, the water rights formalized, the poached hands either returned or recognized as their own choices, the false stories contradicted with evidence. It took 6 months and wore on Walter in a way that was visible only to Edith, who knew how to read the set of his jaw and the length of his silences. She did not tell him that she could see it, because he would have felt managed, but she made adjustments, quieter evenings when he needed quiet, more talk when he needed to unload the day's frustrations into words that someone else could hear. Cal eventually sold his land in the spring of 1883 and moved on to wherever such men move on to, and the air around the Tillman operation cleared, and Walter came home on the evening of the day. The sale was recorded with a looseness in his posture that Edith had not seen in 6 months, and she made a good supper, and they put James to bed and sat on the porch in the spring night, and said very little, and it was entirely sufficient. In 1883, Edith's father Harold's health stepped down another level, more significantly this time, following a second, smaller heart episode that left him with less breath and less energy. He continued to come to the store but for shorter hours, and Tommy Garrett took on more of the daily operations, and Harold supervised from his chair with his notebooks and his quiet satisfaction in the work continuing around him. Edith spent more time at her father's house in those months, sitting with him in the evenings, reading aloud when he was tired, or simply sitting in companionable quiet in the way they had always been comfortable with each other. She brought James, and Harold delighted in his grandson's energy with the fond exhaustion of a man who loves something too vigorous for his current capacity. Walter came when he could, and he was gentle with Harold in the particular way that men are gentle with men they respect who are diminishing, without condescension or false brightness, just presence and regard. Harold Bancroft died in March of 1884, on a Tuesday morning when the light was just coming through the east window of his bedroom, quietly and without pain, which was the death that suited him, and which Edith received with the grief of someone who had been preparing for it, and found that preparation only partially useful. She had known it was coming. She had known it for 2 years. She had said what needed saying. She had held her father's hand through his last afternoon, and she had been there when he went. She had done all of it right, as much as such a thing can be done right, and it still hollowed her in a way that nothing had hollowed her since her mother. Walter was with her every moment that he could be. He was not a man who knew what to say in grief, and he did not pretend to be. He simply stayed. He took care of James. He handled the practical matters, the funeral arrangements, the notifications, the closing of the store's daily operations for the period of mourning, with an efficiency and a gentleness that she was grateful for with her whole soul. He held her when she cried, which she did not do often but did do twice, with a completeness that left her emptied and then strangely steadied. At the funeral, which was well attended because Harold had been a quiet cornerstone of Caldwell for nearly a decade, Walter stood beside Edith and did not take her hand because she was holding herself with both arms, and he understood. He always understood that there were forms of grief that needed to be held from inside rather than supported from outside, and he stood close enough that she could feel his presence without any pressure attached to it. And she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that she had married exactly the right person. She was 26.5 years old, and she was now without either parent, and the store was hers. After a period of genuine consideration, she decided to keep it running. Tommy Garrett had become capable enough to manage the daily operations, and Edith handled the ordering and the accounts, and the store continued to be Bancroft's Dry Goods, because she saw no reason to change the name and considerable reason to keep it. It was her father's name and her own name, and the store was a good store, and Caldwell needed good stores. This arrangement worked well, and Edith found that running the business with more authority than she'd had while subordinating to Harold's preferences was both different and satisfying. She made a few changes that she had wanted to make for years but had not pressed because they were not her place to press, expanded the book and paper section, brought in a wider range of medicinal goods, established a credit arrangement for farmers and homesteaders who needed goods through the planting season, and would settle accounts at harvest. That last arrangement was the most significant change and caused some skepticism locally until it worked, which it did, and then people thought it had always been obvious. She brought James to the store on many mornings, setting up a corner for him with a wooden horse that Walter had carved, and a set of blocks and books that held his attention for the variable and unpredictable intervals characteristic of 2.5-year-olds, and the regular customers found this arrangement either charming or irritating in equal measure, which Edith thought was a fair split. Walter watched his wife manage everything with the admiration of a man who is not threatened by competence but genuinely delighted by it. He said to her one evening, "You know you're remarkable." "I know I work hard," she said. "That's not the same thing." "In your case it is," he said, with the simplicity of a man who means what he says. She laughed. She said, "You're biased." "Completely," he agreed. "That doesn't make me wrong." In the summer of 1884, Edith was pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the first in the early months, with a persistent nausea that lasted longer than expected and a fatigue that was more demanding, and she was less able to work through it without cost. Walter adjusted accordingly. He hired an additional hand at the ranch that he had been meaning to hire anyway, which gave him more flexibility to come home earlier. Agnes came again, because she seemed to have a sixth sense for when she was needed, and stayed for 6 weeks in the worst of the heat. Their daughter was born in February of 1885, during a cold snap that made the frost patterns on the windows look like lace, and they named her Clara Margaret Sutton, the Clara for Edith's school friend in Cincinnati and the Margaret for Edith's mother. And Clara was a serene and watchful baby who studied the world from her first days with enormous gray eyes that would darken as she grew to the same river water color as her mother's. James, who was 3 years and 4 months old when Clara arrived, was initially uncertain about this development and expressed his uncertainty by becoming louder and more demanding for approximately 2 weeks. And then he made his peace with his sister and became, over time, a devoted and slightly overbearing older brother who would be a source of both comfort and irritation to Clara for the rest of their lives. Walter had a way with both children that Edith watched with a love she could not always contain decorously. He was not a demonstrative man in most contexts, but with James and Clara he was differently constituted, patient in a way that cost him nothing because it came from enjoyment rather than discipline, and when he lay on the floor and let James use him as a climbing structure, or sat in the rocking chair with Clara pressed against his chest in the early evenings, reading from the almanac because it was what was nearest to hand, and Clara was too young to care what words he was reading as long as she heard his voice. Edith thought that this, exactly this, was what she had been moving toward all her life without knowing it. The years between 1885 and 1887 were full and ordinary in the best possible sense. The ranch grew steadily. The store thrived. James started attending the local school and was, by all accounts, more interested in the horses being ridden past the school window than in the lessons inside it, though his mother made certain that books were a constant presence in his life, and he gradually developed a grudging respect for them. Clara grew into a small person of decided opinions and great observational acuity, watching everything with those gray-green eyes and filing it somewhere interior that occasionally produced comments at unexpected moments that made both her parents stop and look at each other. Edith and Walter's marriage had the quality of a partnership that has been tested enough to know its strength. They disagreed, because they were two people with genuine opinions and the habit of expressing them, and when they disagreed, they worked through it with the directness that had always characterized them, which was sometimes sharp and always honest and invariably arrived at resolution. They were affectionate in the private way of people who do not make their tenderness a performance, and the affection deepened rather than fading, because they continued to be genuinely interested in each other, which is a rarer form of good fortune than people acknowledge. Walter continued to write when he was away, which was less frequent now but still occasional. A letter from Wichita when he was there for a week negotiating a new contract for Tillman. A letter from Abilene when he had to go there on a matter of cattle registration that required his signature in person. She put each letter in the tin box as it came, adding to the stack that now numbered well past 60. He still did not know about the box. It had simply never come up, and she had not raised it, because it still felt like something that was hers, an archive of the love as it had built itself, and she had a private understanding that she would show it to him someday when the moment was right. The moment arrived on a September evening in 1887, and it arrived not because she had planned it, but because of what happened with Clara. Clara was 2.5 years old and had gotten into the trunk at the foot of the bed. This was a regular occurrence, as Clara found the trunk irresistible for reasons that appeared to be purely aesthetic. She liked the smell of the cedar lining and the various textures of the things stored inside. On this particular September evening, Edith came into the bedroom to find Clara sitting on the floor surrounded by the contents of the trunk, including the quilt and several pairs of carefully folded stockings, and the tin box, which she had removed and was examining with the focused attention of a scientist studying a specimen. Edith sat down on the floor beside her daughter, which was the particular kind of surrender that small children require. "What have you found, then?" She said, "Blue flowers," Clara said. She was tracing the painted flowers on the lid of the box. "Yes," said Edith. "Those are your grandmother's flowers. That was your grandmother Margaret's box." Clara looked at the box with new interest. She patted it. "Open," she said. Edith opened it. She took out the stack of letters, held together now by a piece of cotton twine she had tied around them when the stack grew too large to sit neatly. Clara reached for them with both hands, and Edith held them out of reach, and then felt the absurdity of that and felt, at the same moment, the clear and settled conviction that the time for the private had passed and the time for the shared had come. She heard Walter's boots on the porch, the familiar specific sound of him coming home, and the door opening and his voice in the kitchen. "Edith." "Bedroom," she called. He came to the doorway and found them both sitting on the floor, his daughter surrounded by the contents of the trunk and his wife holding a thick stack of letters tied with cotton twine, and his expression asked the question before his mouth did. "What's all this?" he said. Edith looked at him and she felt the moment settle around her like something falling gently into place. She held out the letters. "These are all the letters you sent me," she said. "Every one, since the very first." He came into the room and crouched down to her level, and he looked at the stack of letters with an expression that was very still and very attentive, the way he looked at things that mattered. "You kept them all," he said. It was not quite a question. "Every one," she said again. "I've kept them in my mother's tin box since the beginning. I never mentioned it because it was a private thing, but I want you to know now." He sat down on the floor, which was not a thing that Walter Sutton did habitually, and he took the stack of letters from her and held them, and she watched him absorb the weight of them. Clara, sensing that something significant was happening in a way that required her participation, climbed into his lap and patted his arm. He put one arm around her automatically without looking away from the letters. "All of them," he said again, quietly. "I couldn't throw any of them away," Edith said. "From the very first, when you wrote about Agnes and the paper and how you tried to keep her from feeling far from things. I didn't know then what it was going to be. I only knew I couldn't part with it." He untied the twine carefully, and he looked at the first letter, the one from April of 1879, the letter about the trail south and the changing sky and how Caldwell had felt different after meeting her. His handwriting from 8 years ago, on the paper she had sold him across the counter of her father's store. She watched him sit there on the bedroom floor with Clara in his lap and the whole archive of their love in his hands, and she watched his face do something she had only seen it do a handful of times in the years she had known him, lose its composure entirely, not in distress, but in the opposite of distress, in the particular undoing that comes from being confronted with evidence of love that is larger than you knew. "You kept all of these," he said, and his voice was different, lower and fuller. "I did," she said. "Why didn't you tell me?" She thought about it for a moment, really thought about it, because he deserved the accurate answer. "Because I needed to be able to be sure about what I felt before I showed anyone else how much of it there was," she said. "And then it became a kind of waiting for the right time. This is the right time." He looked at her with those dark eyes that she had known for 8 years and still found profound, and he said, "Edith," just her name. The way he said her name was different from the way other people said it, as though the syllables meant more than syllables. "What?" she said softly. "I didn't know," he said. "I knew you felt what I felt, more or less, but I didn't know it looked like this." He lifted the stack of letters slightly. "I didn't know you were keeping all of it." "Now you know," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and Clara, finding the quiet agreeable, had settled against his chest and was fingering the top button of his shirt with the idle concentration of a small person with nothing pressing. "I should have kept yours," he said, and there was something in his tone that was the specific regret of a man who is not given to regret and therefore feels it more sharply when it arrives. "You were on the trail," she said. "You were moving. There was no way to carry them properly. I knew that." "I kept one," he said suddenly, and she looked at him. "Which one?" He reached into the pocket of his vest and she thought he was about to produce it, but instead he said, "Not here. It's in my desk at the office. The first one you ever sent me." He looked at her steadily. "I've always had it with me. I copied it out twice when it started to wear from folding, so I'd always have it whole." She felt something move through her that was not quite tears but was related to tears, the cellular cousin of them. "You copied it," she said. "Twice," he said. "The original is in my desk still. The second copy is in my saddlebag." She pressed her lips together, and she thought about the first letter she had sent him, the one about the books and the fence dispute and Harold's seed catalog, and the way the prairie made visible a person's actual scale in the world. And she thought about that letter traveling with him through all those years on the trail, and then from the trail to the ranch to Caldwell and sitting in his saddlebag still, and she understood that the box was not only hers. "Go get it," she said. "Now." "Now," she said. He transferred Clara to her own lap, which Clara protested briefly and then accepted, and he went to his desk in the room he used as an office, and she heard him open the drawer, and he came back with a folded paper that was not new and was not old, but was the specific worn softness of something often handled and carefully preserved. He sat back down on the floor beside her, and he opened it, and she read her own handwriting from 8 years ago, slightly faded, the fold lines white from repeated creasing, and beside the words she had written there were small marks in pencil, his, not annotations of the text but checks, she thought, marks made when he had read particular parts again and wanted to mark his place, the way a person marks the passages in a book they intend to return to. She was undone by the pencil marks. She pressed her fingers to her eyes for a moment, and he put his arm around her, and they sat there on the bedroom floor of their house in Caldwell, Kansas, in September of 1887, with Clara between them and the tin box open, and the stack of 60-odd letters on the floor and his one carefully preserved letter open in his hand. And it was the fullest moment of Edith's life up to that point, because she had not known that what she had done in private had its mirror in him. That they had been keeping each other, without knowing the other was keeping them. "I love you," she said, which was not something they said frequently, not because they felt it infrequently, but because when they said it, they meant it in its complete form, and that required selectivity. "I love you more than I know how to say, and I have since before I knew it." "Since before you knew it," he repeated as though filing it. "Since before I knew it," she confirmed. He pressed his lips to her hair, and Clara, patient enough with adult behavior for about another 30 seconds, said, "Papa." "Supper." They both laughed, the real kind, and the spell became something more ordinary and equally good, and Walter got up and lifted Clara and said, "Supper it is, then." And the evening proceeded as evenings do, with food and noise and a small boy who came home from a neighbor's yard with muddy boots and a complicated story. And the letters went back in the tin box, and the tin box went back in the trunk, but nothing was quite the same as it had been before the opening. In the way that nothing is quite the same once you have been seen completely. He brought the letter from his desk and put it in the box too, tucked at the front, and she tied the twine around the whole collection again, and the box went in the trunk under her mother's quilt, and they both knew it was there. In the autumn of 1887, Caldwell continued to evolve. The cattle trade, which had been the heartbeat of the town since its founding, was beginning to shift as the railroads extended, and the range was increasingly fenced, and the open trail was becoming something more complicated than it had been. The Kishom Trail was not what it had been in 1879. The era of the great cattle drives was narrowing, and the men who had built their lives around that particular rhythm were having to adapt or move on. Walter adapted. He had always been more a man of land than of trail, if he was honest about it, and the ranch management suited him in a way that the trail drives never fully had. He had the patience for land, the long-view thinking that good land stewardship required, the willingness to invest in years rather than seasons. Tillman trusted him completely and gave him increasing autonomy, and the operation under Walter's management became one of the more stable and well-regarded ranches in the county. He hired 2 additional permanent hands in 1888, and established a system of cattle management that reduced winter losses significantly by better planning around shelter and feed stores, which was not glamorous, but was the kind of thing that made the difference between an operation that succeeded and one that merely survived. Edith, watching all of this from her own vantage point, thought that Walter Sutton was one of those people who made what they did look inevitable, as though the work and the skill and the judgment were simply what they were and had always been, when in fact they were the result of years of learning and attention, and the willingness to get things wrong and correct. She was running the store with considerable success by 1888, and had expanded into a second room that the neighboring property provided when its previous tenant, a bootmaker, relocated to Wichita. She brought in a wider range of household goods and established a small lending library from her own book collection, which was technically not a commercial enterprise, but generated so much goodwill that it was worth considerably more than its cost. Tommy Garrett was her full partner in the store's operation by now, and she had given him a share in the business that year, a formalization of what had already been true in practice, because she believed that people who did the work should have the stake, and Tommy had done the work for 9 years. James, at 7 years old, was developing into a person of great physical energy and intellectual stubbornness, which Edith recognized as her own intellectual stubbornness expressed in her husband's physical constitution, and she found this combination both predictable and charming and occasionally exhausting. He was reading well and was particularly fascinated by natural history, which his father encouraged by naming everything they encountered on the ranch and explaining how it worked, and Edith encouraged by bringing him every book on the subject she could find, including a natural history of the Great Plains that a supplier in Kansas City had sent as part of a consignment. Clara, at 3 years old, was a person of great internal life who expressed it in selective but precise ways. She had become devoted to her father's old copy of Marcus Aurelius, not to reading it, she was 3, but to carrying it. She carried it under her arm around the house and left it in specific locations with what appeared to be intention, and when Walter noticed and asked Edith about it, Edith said, "She knows it was important to you," and Walter had looked at his small daughter carrying his old book and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "She's going to be remarkable." "She already is," Edith said. Agnes Sutton married in Texas in the summer of 1888. A good man named Robert Aldridge who farmed cotton near their home county, and she wrote to Edith with a happiness that was vibrating off every page of her letter, and Edith wrote back with genuine joy and the particular warmth she felt for Agnes, who had been part of the story from the very beginning, the girl that Walter had been buying writing paper for when he first walked into Bancroft's dry goods. Walter and Edith went to Texas for the wedding, leaving James and Clara with a neighbor family for the 2 weeks they were gone, which was the longest they had been away from the children, and which both of them felt as a physical absence the whole time, though they did not admit this to each other until they were on the way home. The Texas wedding was warm and loud, and full of people who had known Walter his whole life, and who greeted Edith with the curious scrutiny of people meeting the person who had changed one of their own. She was not shy, and she met every look directly, and by the end of the first day the verdict was clearly favorable, partly because she was genuinely warm and interesting, and partly because it was unmistakably clear that Walter was deeply happy, and anyone who had known him for years could see that happiness was not his default state. It was something that had to be earned by the right conditions. His father's older sister, a formidable woman named Dorothy Sutton who had known the family for decades, took Edith's hand at the end of the wedding reception and held it and said, "He wrote to me when he first met you. He didn't know he was telling me what it meant, but he was. I'm glad you kept him." "He kept himself," Edith said. "I only made room." Dorothy Sutton looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Yes, that's exactly it," and released her hand. On the train home to Kansas, sitting across from Walter in the evening light of the passenger car, Edith told him what Dorothy had said. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was actually thinking rather than when he had nothing to say. She always saw more than she let on, he said. She was right, Edith said. You wrote to her about me. I wrote to her about everything, he said, with a slight defensiveness that was also affection, and then, after a pause, you were the most important thing at that point. She looked at him across the small table in the train car, the Kansas landscape passing outside the window in the long evening light, familiar and enormous and completely theirs in the way a landscape becomes yours when you have lived with it long enough. I still have that first letter, she said. I know, he said. I know you have all of them. She looked at him, surprised. He smiled, the contained one, the one that reached his eyes. I've known since Clara found the box, he said. I went to the trunk the next morning when you were at the store. I counted them. She felt something that was not quite surprise and not quite laughter. You counted them. 63, he said. 63 letters over 8 years. 64, she said. There's one from Abilene that I added before I reorganized them. He shook his head slowly, and the smile was the full one now. 64 letters. Every one, she said. The train carried them home through the last of the evening light, and when they arrived at Caldwell Station and stepped down onto the platform with their bags, the familiar smell of the town, the grass and the dust and the particular quality of the Kansas air, wrapped around them like something expected and welcome. And Edith thought, this is home, this exactly. This place and this man and this life. They had one more child in 1890, a boy they named George, and he was different from both his siblings in the specific and delightful way that children in the same family can be entirely distinct. Loud where Clara was quiet, physical where James was studious, sunny-tempered where both the others could be intense. George was from his first months a person of uncomplicated cheerfulness, that his parents found both wonderful and slightly baffling, as though he had arrived with a disposition that had not been predicted by any of the available hereditary material. Walter held George in the delivery room the way he had held James 9 years before, with that same undone openness on his face, and Edith thought that love did not divide when a family grew, it only multiplied, and she found this to be factually correct in practice over all the years that followed. The 1890s brought changes to Caldwell and to the wider territory that were both expected and striking. Kansas continued to grow. The cattle trade had transformed significantly, and the wild and tumble character of the early cattle town had given way to something more settled and more deliberate. The saloons were fewer and the churches were more, and the farmers were doing well in the years of good rain and less well in the years of drought, and the particular volatility of prairie life that could not be regulated by will or intention continued to be one of the defining conditions of the place. Edith watched the changes with interest because she had always been interested in the way things shifted over time. The store adapted as the town adapted, and she proved to be good at anticipating what would be needed before it was generally recognized as needed, which was the essential skill of a merchant and also of a person who paid close attention to how other people were living. She had Tommy Garrett's full partnership and had brought in a second employee by 1891, a woman named Dorothea Miles who had come to Caldwell with her husband, a carpenter, and who turned out to be an excellent merchant with a good head for inventory and a manner with customers that was different from Edith's but equally effective. Edith thought Dorothea was a lucky find and told her so, which was the sort of direct appreciation that Dorothea was not accustomed to from an employer, and that inspired a loyalty that lasted years. James, at 10 and 11 and 12, was deepening into himself in the way that children do when their nature begins to be visible through the developing personality. He loved the ranch and loved the horses with a consistency that was clearly not a phase, and Walter had started bringing him out to the Tillman land on Saturdays where he worked with the horses alongside the hands with a seriousness that the hands, most of whom liked him, found impressive for his age. Edith watched this with the particular mixed emotion of a mother who can see what her child is meant for, and who is simultaneously proud of it, and privately worried about the kinds of risk it involves. Clara at 7 was reading everything she could reach, which included all of the lending library books, and most of the natural history collection that had been built for James, and the almanacs that Walter kept, and the account ledgers that Edith used. And while the account ledgers were perhaps not ideal reading material, Edith found she could not quite bring herself to discourage reading in any form, and so she compromised by sitting with Clara when she reviewed the ledgers and explaining what she was looking at, which Clara found fascinating and absorbed with the totality of attention that was her particular gift. George at 3 was entirely concerned with the present moment, and specifically with what was in the nearest drawer or cupboard, and Edith had become very good at securing things that could not safely be accessed by a 3-year-old, with excellent fine motor skills and no particular fear of heights. Walter, in 1892, was offered a partnership in the Tillman operation, a formal stake in the land and the cattle in exchange for his continued management, and a capital investment that he could make from savings accumulated over 13 years of careful living. He came home the evening of the offer and told Edith about it at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, with the papers Tillman had given him laid out in front of them both, and they looked at the numbers together as they had always looked at the significant questions of their life together, both of them reading the same information and bringing their different minds to it. "Do you want it?" she asked after they had examined the terms. "It's fair," he said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "I want it, this land, this operation, yes." "Then yes," she said. "It's our savings," he said. "It's both of ours." "And the store is mine and it's also ours," she said. "We share everything. The decision to make it is the same kind of decision. I'm telling you yes." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You've always been better at this than me," he said. "At what?" "At deciding," he said. "At knowing what you think and saying it." She smiled. "You're good at thinking it. You just sometimes need someone to hear it first before you can say it." He thought about that. "That's probably right," he said. The partnership was formalized in spring of 1892, and Walter Sutton became a part owner of what was now the Tillman Sutton Ranch, 12,000 acres of Kansas cattle country, which was not the modest ambition of a young trail boss from East Texas, but was the patient accumulation of 13 years of good work and good judgment, and a marriage that had made both partners more than they would have been separately. The years passed in the full, ordinary, occasionally dramatic way that the years of a real life pass. James at 15 was riding like a man twice his experience, and had shown, to everyone's surprise including his own, an aptitude for the mathematics of land management that made Walter think he would eventually be more valuable in the ranch's operations than could be currently imagined. Clara at 10 had announced with calm certainty that she intended to become a teacher, which surprised no one who had seen her reading and explaining things to her brothers with the patient authority of someone who was born for the transmission of knowledge. George at 5 was the kind of child about whom it was too early to make any predictions and too late to think no predictions were forming, because he was clearly a person of great social ease and considerable persuasive capacity, which were qualities that could take a person in many directions. Edith and Walter, in the middle of the 1890s, had arrived at the particular middle place of a marriage that has been built carefully, a place of ease and depth, and the kind of intimacy that is not performance, but is simply the accumulated texture of two people who have chosen each other every day for 15 years. They knew each other's silences as well as their words. They could disagree without unraveling. They could sit in a room together without speaking and be entirely in communication. She still opened the tin box sometimes. Not often, but sometimes, on the evenings when the children were asleep and Walter was at his desk going over the ranch accounts and the house was quiet, she would take out the stack of letters and hold them without reading them, feeling the weight of all those years and all those words and the life that had been built on their foundation. One evening in 1895, Walter found her doing this. He came into the bedroom for something and saw her sitting on the edge of the bed with the tin box open and the letters in her lap, and he stood in the doorway for a moment and she looked up at him. "Counting them," he said. "Just holding them," she said. He came and sat beside her on the bed and she handed him the stack and he held them the way she held them, the weight rather than the words. "I'm going to write you another one," he said. "Tomorrow, even though I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him. "Why? Because they should keep going," he said. "Because it's not finished." She leaned against him and he put his arm around her and they sat with the letters in his lap and the tin box open between them on the quilt, the blue flowers painted on the lid. "Walter," she said. "What?" "I think this is the happiest I have ever been," she said. "I think this particular moment right now is it." He pressed his lips to her hair. "Give it 10 minutes," he said very quietly. "I've noticed the best ones keep getting better." She laughed, low and real, and he held her. And the house around them was full of the sleeping breath of their 3 children, and the particular living quiet of a home that has been made by people who meant to make it. He wrote to her the next morning before she was up, a single page left on the kitchen table beside her coffee cup, and she found it when she came downstairs. It was not long. It said, among other things, that he had been thinking about the first letter he had written to her from the trail south in April of 1879, and that he had been wrong in it without knowing he was wrong, because he had written that Caldwell had felt different after meeting her, as though it was the place that had changed, and that he understood now that it was not the place at all. It was him. He had been different. He had felt the difference in everything because he was different. And that he had not known at the time how to say that, so he had said it sideways, but he was saying it now directly, which was that she had changed him, not by requiring him to change, but by being herself with such completeness that everything in him had rearranged itself toward that, and he was grateful every day for the rearranging. She read this letter standing at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold, and then she read it again, and she went to the tin box and put it inside, and she tied the twine around all of them, 65 letters now, and she put the box in its place. James turned 18 in 1899 and began working full-time at the Tillman Sutton Ranch, riding alongside the hands and taking on the record-keeping and supply management with a methodical attention that Walter recognized as his wife's mathematical precision, combined with something of his own patience. He had grown into a tall, steady young man, dark like his father, with his mother's river water eyes, and Walter watched him working with the same contained pride that his own face showed when something mattered beyond what he could easily express. Clara, at 14, was already teaching Sunday school with more rigor and enthusiasm than the adults who nominally supervised the program, and was reading everything that Edith could send her way. She had written to Clara Hooper in Cincinnati, Edith's old school friend and her namesake, and begun a correspondence of her own that delighted the original Clara and charmed Edith completely. George at 12 was becoming, as predicted by no one and retrospectively inevitable to everyone, the most socially gifted of the 3 Sutton children, with a gift for understanding what different people needed to hear that would eventually make him either a remarkably good politician or a remarkably good clergyman. And the family watched him with the fond puzzlement of people who love someone they cannot entirely predict. The century turned. January 1, 1900, arrived in Kansas with the flat pragmatism of the calendar making an arbitrary accounting while the land paid no attention, the grass still brown and the sky still wide, and the cattle still moving slowly through the winter fields. Walter and Edith saw the new year in together at the kitchen table with 2 glasses of the good whiskey Walter kept for significant occasions, and they sat quietly for a while in the first minutes of 1900 and thought about what it meant to have lived through the whole of the previous century's last 2 decades in this place, building what they had built. 20 years ago, Edith said, I was watching you ride south and wondering if you would actually write. "I always intended to write," he said. "I know that now," she said. "Did you doubt it then?" She considered this honestly. "I hoped," she said. "I didn't know there's a difference." He nodded slowly, understanding the distinction because he was someone who had always understood the difference between hope and certainty. And when the first letter came, he said, "I sat down at the counter in the store before my father was awake and read it 3 times," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight, this woman he had written to for 20 years and lived beside for 20 years and loved with everything he had for 20 years, and he said, "I didn't know that." "I know you didn't," she said. "Now you do." He reached across the table and took her hand, the way he had the first time at the edge of town in the April sunset, and the way he had every time since then that deserved it, and she let him hold it and held his in return. "The letters are still in the box," he said. "All of them," she confirmed. "Good," he said, with that complete simplicity of his. "Good." Clara graduated from the normal school at Wichita in 1903, which was an achievement that her mother attended in her best dress with her chin held at the angle she held it when she was proud, but intended to maintain composure. Walter went too, missing 2 days of ranch work that he arranged to be covered, and when Clara received her certificate and walked off the stage with those gray-green eyes of hers steady and bright, Edith looked at Walter and he looked at her, and nothing needed to be said. Clara took a position at the school in Caldwell the following September, which meant she stayed close, which none of them had required of her but all of them were glad of. She was a teacher of the kind that students remembered for the rest of their lives, clear and demanding and genuinely interested in what each child was capable of, which made her both loved and sometimes feared in the way that all genuinely good teachers are. James married in 1904, a woman named Ruth Calley from the farming county south of Caldwell, sensible and dry-humored and deeply devoted to her husband's horses, which James took as evidence of excellent judgment. Walter and Edith welcomed her with the ease of people who have been waiting for someone good and recognized it when it arrived. And Ruth, who had been uncertain about meeting Walter Sutton, who had the reputation in the county for absolute standards, found that his standards applied primarily to honesty and work, and that everything else he was remarkably easy about. George, who had turned 21 in 1907, had spent the previous 3 years working in Wichita at a newspaper, where his social gifts and his sharp understanding of what people wanted to know had proven commercially useful, and he was by 1907 writing a regular column on agricultural matters that was read across several counties, and was beginning to build the kind of name that names get built on when a person is suited to exactly what they're doing. In the summer of 1907, on a warm August evening when the children had all come home for a gathering that Edith had organized because she believed in gathering, she brought the tin box out after supper and put it on the table. Walter looked at it from across the room, and he knew what it was. He always knew what it was, and he came and sat beside her. The 3 Sutton children and Ruth looked at the box with varying degrees of curiosity, and Edith opened it and took out the letters, and she told them the story. She told it fully from the beginning, from the good-weight writing paper bought across the counter by a trail-worn cowboy who was trying to keep his young sister from feeling far from things, through all the letters and all the years, through the courtship and the wedding and the long correspondence of the married life, through Clara finding the box when she was 2.5 years old and changing everything by demanding to see the blue flowers. She passed the letters around the table, not all of them, but the first ones and a few from the middle and the most recent, and her children held them with the careful hands of people touching something that has been sacred, because they were. James held the very first letter, the one from April of 1879, and read a passage aloud, and the sound of his father's handwriting given his mother's voice was something that stopped the room. Clara said, 65 letters. 68 now, Edith said. He's written 3 more since I last told him the count. Walter said, 69. I mailed one to you last month from Wichita. It arrived the day after you did, Edith said. 69. George said 69 letters in the considering voice of a journalist who was calculating the shape of a story. Did you ever consider not keeping them? Never, Edith said. Why? George asked. She looked at Walter and he looked at her and she said, because they were the evidence. You keep the evidence of the things you want to remember were real. Ruth, who had not met this family until 4 years ago and was still occasionally surprised by them, said quietly, "That's beautiful." "It's practical," Edith said, though she was smiling. "You can be both," Walter said. The gathering continued long into the evening, the way good gatherings do, with food and stories and the particular ease of people who are genuinely glad to be in the same room. And when eventually the evening ended and the children went to their various beds and rooms, Edith and Walter sat on the porch in the summer night, the tin box between them on the porch rail. 69 letters, she said. And counting, he said. She looked at him. You intend to keep writing? I intend to write you letters for the rest of my life, he said. Whether or not I have somewhere to go to make it a proper correspondence, I'll write you a letter from across the room if that's what it requires. She felt the fullness of that the way she felt the fullness of the good things in the chest and in the throat and in that particular warm heaviness behind the eyes. Then I'll keep keeping them, she said. Good, he said. They sat in the August dark, the Kansas sky above them enormous and indifferent and magnificently full of stars, and the prairie around them breathing its dry summer breath, and the town of Caldwell quiet in the way it got quiet after midnight when the work of the day was done, and the next day had not yet begun. She reached over and took his hand on the porch rail, and he turned his hand and held hers back, and they sat like that for a long time in the warm dark, two people who had come to each other through letters and walking and the slow accumulated evidence of who they were, and who had built, on that foundation, a whole life that was full and specific and continuing and theirs. The tin box sat between them with its blue flowers catching the moonlight, all 69 letters inside, and the story that those letters contained, the whole shape of how they had come to be what they were, was fully theirs now, shared and witnessed, the private made permanent, the letters given their proper place in the larger account of the life they had made. In the autumn of 1907, Walter did write a 70th letter, as promised, from the kitchen table while Edith was upstairs with Clara discussing the school year, and she found it propped against the coffee pot the next morning and added it to the box. He wrote an 81st by 1910, and she kept them all, in the tin box with the blue painted flowers that had belonged to her mother, under the quilt at the foot of their bed, in the house at the edge of Caldwell, in the state of Kansas, in the life they had built together out of paper and ink, and the willingness to say the true thing to the right person. And James Sutton, at 28, had his first son in 1909, and Walter became a grandfather in the specific and comprehensive way that a man who has always understood that everything connects became a grandfather, with the patience and the attention and the long view. And Edith became a grandmother in the way she had always been herself, directly and warmly, and with the particular gift for listening that had never left her. The boy was named Harold Walter Sutton, and he was the first of several grandchildren who would grow up knowing the store and the ranch and the wide Kansas sky, and who would know, because their parents told them and their grandparents confirmed it, that there was a tin box in the trunk at the foot of the old bedroom, and in it were the letters, all of them, going back to 1879, and that this was what love looked like when it was taken seriously. Walter Sutton lived long and purposefully, and Edith Bancroft Sutton lived longer, and what they had made between them, out of writing paper and honesty and the unguarded willingness to be known by each other, held through everything that came after, through good years and hard ones, through loss and growth and all the ordinary remarkable days of a life shared fully, and the tin box with the blue flowers on the lid sat in its place at the foot of the bed through all of it, patient and full and quietly keeping count.